Welcome to my true criminal abode. Today's case is about, well, it's about two people. Two people that never met. One of them, 11-year-old Lesley Molseed, was tragically murdered. The other one was 23-year-old Stefan Kiszko, who was sent to jail for her murder. Yet these were two people who never crossed paths. One of them lost her life, and the other lost 16 years of his life because of it. Today we're looking at one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in British history. So today's case is twofold. It's about the murder of Lesley Molseed and the man who paid the price. So Lesley Susan Molseed was born on the 14th of August 1964, making her 11 years old at the time of this case. Lesley was living on Delamere Road on the Turf Hill estate in Rochdale in Greater Manchester, here in England. She lived with her mother, April, her stepfather, Danny, and her three older siblings, Laura, Freddie, and Julie, making her the youngest child in a very lively working class family. It was the kind of neighbourhood where people knew each other and children played freely in the streets. It was the 70s spirit, that kind of carefree 70s time. Turf Hill Estate, where Lesley lived, was a mix of post-war council housing and older red brick rows of terraced houses. The streets were narrow, the houses were close together, and everything had that familiar northern grit. The estate itself sat on the edge of open moorland, where the town gave way to wide, exposed hills and rough grassland. If you want a kind of idea, it wasn't too far away from where the Moor's murders took place. Now, Lesley herself, her early years had been shaped by serious medical problems. She was born with a congenital heart defect. At 3 years old, she underwent open heart surgery, which was a major operation that saved her life. The condition, though, left her physically very small and developmentally delayed. So by the age of 11, she was actually under 4 feet tall and weighed only around about 3 stone. She was a teeny tiny little thing, bless her. She looked a lot younger than her age. She looked more like sort of 6 or 7 years old rather than the 11-year-old that she was. Her mental age was estimated to be that of a 4-year-old, a detail that made her especially dependent on the adults around her, and also tragically ill-equipped to recognise some of the danger that she would soon face. Despite her challenges, Lesley was remembered as a gentle, affectionate, cheerful little girl. At home, she was known as Lel, a nickname that showed how loved and how special she was. She adored music, especially the Bay City Rollers. This was a passion that she shared with her sister Laura. The two of them would squabble over posters and memorabilia. Lesley would regularly take the posters from Laura's bedroom and pin them in her own room, much to her sister's annoyance. Lesley's world was small and familiar and predictable. She was vulnerable, but she was surrounded by a loving family, helpful neighbours, and routines that made her feel safe. But tragically, this vulnerable, sweet little girl was about to be at the centre of one of Britain's most tragic miscarriages of justice. Sunday the 5th of October 1975 began as an ordinary day in the Molseed household, with the usual mix of chores and comings and goings of family life. Lesley had spent the morning playing and helping her mother with small tasks. Around about lunchtime, April was making lunch when she realised that she needed bread. They had a rota set up in their house, and it was actually Fred's turn to go to the shop, but he wasn't in. So April asked Lesley to go and get the bread and a can of air freshener as well. It was a simple, mundane task that Lesley had completed many, many times before. Now, Lesley's poor health often made her feel lethargic, and she would kind of sit by the window watching other children play outside. So when Lesley was feeling well, she enjoyed being trusted with these small chores, these small responsibilities. And the short 10-minute walk to the shop, it was familiar to her. Wearing a pleated pink skirt and her favourite Bay City Rollers socks, Lesley put on her blue raincoat. She tucked a £1 note into her purse and set off along her usual route. The walk from her home in Delamere Road to the shop wasn't long, and it took her through residential streets that she knew well. Several people saw her on the way and recognised her. They recognised her distinctive clothing and her small, slight frame. Nothing about her behaviour suggested fear or hesitation. She was simply a child running an errand for her mother until she wasn't, because Lesley never came home. When Lesley didn't return within a reasonable time, her family initially assumed that she had been delayed. Perhaps she had stopped to talk to someone. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, concern began to grow, and April started getting worried. April sent Lesley's siblings out to look for her. First Laura, then Fred, checking the surrounding streets, the usual places where children played. They checked the shop, of course, on Ansdale Road, but no one had seen her. There was no indication that she had even reached the shop. They found nothing. Lesley's stepfather, Danny, joined the search. Now, Danny was Lesley's stepfather. A man called Fred Anderson was Lesley's real father, but by the mid-1970s, her parents had separated and April met Danny. But Danny adored Lesley. He supported her and went to all her hospital appointments, so he really, really was worried. He might have been the stepfather, but he absolutely doted on this little girl. And as the afternoon wore on, this worry turned to fear. And by 3 p.m, April and Danny contacted the police. Officers arrived quickly. It was a lost child, so they responded quickly and began a systematic search of the estate. They retraced Lesley's route, speaking to residents along the way. A number of witnesses confirmed they had seen her taking the backstreet route she often used, and this included an alleyway called Stiop's Lane, which was a narrow footpath lined by the back fences of surrounding houses. It was secluded and hidden from view, but commonly used by the children on the estate as a cut-through. But sadly, it was the place that became the last confirmed sighting of Lesley. It was like she had gone down the alley and never came out the other end. She just disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings, no witnesses who had seen her in distress. There was nothing. As daylight began to fade, the search widened. Obviously, it's starting to get quite late now. If the police were called at 3 p.m, daylight hours were now fading. It's October as well. The nights draw in a lot quicker. Officers pushed beyond the estate boundary into the wasteland and open grounds surrounding the area. The case was treated as a high-priority missing child investigation from the outset. For a child as vulnerable as Lesley, the lack of any sign was deeply alarming. By the next morning, Monday morning, the search had intensified further. Imagine the absolutely horrendous night that the family would have had not knowing where Lesley was. It's every parent's worst nightmare. For 2 days, the search continued with increasing urgency. Police cars toured the estate with loudspeakers, announcing Lesley's disappearance and urging residents to check their gardens, their sheds, their outbuildings. Police dogs were brought in, and officers combed the estate on foot while neighbours joined in. They questioned drivers, shopkeepers, anyone who might have seen a small girl walking alone. Posters were printed, and dozens of volunteers helped search the wider neighbourhood. But still, nothing was found. And then the search intensified even further, extending across Rochdale and along the adjacent M62 motorway. They checked bus routes, nearby towns. A helicopter was deployed to scan the surrounding moorland and open countryside. But despite the scale of the effort, and this was a massive effort, there was just no sightings and no clues. The community remained on high alert. You can imagine the fear in the neighbourhood. Parents kept their children indoors. Everyone who knew Lesley knew she was not a child to wander far or who would willingly go with a stranger. And so everybody was fearing the real possibility that she had been abducted. And tragically, they were right. So on the morning of the 8th of October 1975, 3 days after Lesley disappeared, the search came to a devastating end. The previous evening, a man called David Greenwell had pulled into a lay-by along the A672 at Rishworth Moor to sleep in his car. When he awoke at around 8 a.m. on Wednesday morning, he stepped out and he walked up the embankment of the hill to relieve himself. And in the distance, lying on the side of a hill, he noticed what he first assumed was a bundle of discarded clothing. As he moved closer, he realised it was the body of a small child lying face down in the grass. A mop of curly brown hair spilled from beneath the hood of a blue raincoat. Of course, it was Lesley. At her feet lay an empty navy blue shopping bag, and nearby an unzipped purse with no money inside. Did whoever did this really take her £1 note? She had been discarded like rubbish on a cold, bleak hill on the moor. Officers and forensic teams quickly arrived at the scene. Now, it quickly became clear that Lesley had been murdered. She had been stabbed from behind, sustaining 12 wounds to her neck, her back, her shoulder. One of the stab wounds was so deep that it penetrated her heart. There were no defensive injuries, which is just so sad, because she's so small, she's so vulnerable, she couldn't defend herself. A smear of blood on her left thigh suggested that the killer wiped the knife clean on her clothing or her leg. Lesley was wearing the clothes she had left home in. They hadn't been disturbed. However, semen staining was found on the outside of her underwear and skirt. So although there had been no penetrative assault, she was still sexually assaulted. This was clearly a sexually motivated attack. The semen sample was too small to determine a blood type. And in 1975, DNA profiling didn't exist. So they couldn't extract a DNA profile from the semen to compare against any potential suspect. However, what scientists would go on to discover, and was extremely important to this case, was that the semen contained sperm heads. Right now, that means nothing. But just remember that the semen found on Lesley's body contained sperm heads. So the location where Lesley was found was remote. It was a bleak stretch of moorland, a 20-minute drive from Rochdale. It was the kind of place where a body could lie unnoticed, but also a short turn off the motorway, making it accessible to anybody passing through. And what's more, The exposed terrain made it difficult to determine whether Lesley had been killed at the moor or whether she had been transported there after the attack, though ultimately it was determined that Lesley was most likely murdered on the moor. Forensic scientists were unable to establish an exact time of death. So when they were doing the investigation, they had this 3-day window to look at. They had from the Sunday when she disappeared to the Wednesday morning when her body was found. Now, when they were going through the evidence on the moor, there was also this cold westerly wind sweeping across the moors, and that made collecting evidence really challenging. With every single gust of wind, fibers and trace materials risked being blown away. So what they did, they used sellotape, like adhesive tape, and that was pressed against Lesley's clothing to lift anything that might otherwise be lost in these gusts of wind, And this is actually really crucial later on that they did do this. 2 bright yellow wool fibres were recovered from her jumper and an orange rayon fibre from her right sock. Basically, nothing of importance. It was all very generic evidence. These were fibres that could come from pretty much anywhere. The police also scoured the surrounding area, collecting anything that might prove relevant, including seemingly insignificant items such as discarded pens and scraps of rubbish. Unfortunately, no fingerprints or usable blood evidence were recovered. Now, as you can imagine, back in Rochdale, the news of Lesley's murder sent shockwaves through her community. The atmosphere on the Turf Hill estate turned to grief and to anger. Who would want to do this to her? It didn't make any sense. But what Lesley's discovery did do, it ended any remaining hope and transformed this missing persons search into a major murder inquiry. So the investigation into Lesley Molseed's murder was one of the largest ever mounted in West Yorkshire at the time, with more than 300 officers eventually assigned to the case. Back in Rochdale, detectives began reconstructing Lesley's final movements. They interviewed shopkeepers, neighbours, youth workers, anyone who might have seen her that Sunday. One witness, called Christopher Coverdale, he came forward after hearing of Lesley's death. He had driven past the lay-by at around about 1:45 p.m. on the Sunday and seen a man on the embankment reaching down and pulling a young girl in a blue raincoat up by the hand. The child did not appear distressed, and Coverdale assumed that they were relatives stretching their legs. Oh, this is awful, isn't it? Because she didn't appear distressed. So whatever he had told Lesley, she followed him. She went with him up this hill. When detectives took him back to the scene, he pointed to an area close to where Lesley's body had been found. So it was definitely Lesley that this man saw, that this witness saw, with this gentleman. I'm being a bit kind calling him a gentleman, actually. Scrub that with this monster. Now, this was a crucial lead because it provided a potential description of the perpetrator, as well as a potential timestamp that could help eliminate other witness accounts or sightings outside these times. Now, we can also assume from Coverdale's description of this incident that Lesley was taken pretty soon after leaving her house around about 12:30 on the Sunday lunchtime, so probably around about 12:45, and then she was spotted alive on the moor an hour later, meaning she was murdered on the side of that hill. It's horrendous. In the blink of an eye, someone can take a child's life. Her vulnerabilities meant she was trusting. She wasn't stupid, just trusting. And being so small, she would have been so easy to coerce as well. So by mid-October, the scale of the inquiry had grown again. They were scouring everything, desperate to find Lesley's killer. Detectives reviewed mental health records, checked for recently released or escaped psychiatric patients. They examined crime reports across Greater Manchester to see whether Lesley's killer might have attacked before. And this is where the investigation makes an interesting turn, and a life-changing turn for one man. So detectives began looking closely at reports of a man exposing himself around the Kingsway estate in the days before Lesley disappeared. The Kingsway estate was kind of the neighbouring estate to Turf Hill Estate, where Lesley was from. So on the evening of Friday, the 3rd of October 1975, so before Lesley was murdered, several girls at the Kingsway Park Youth Club, including Catherine Burke, Pamela Hind and Debbie Brown, reported that a man had jumped out, opened his coat, dropped his trousers, exposed himself, and threatened them, saying, "When I get you bastards, I'll shove this right up you." Now, this was the account recorded by the police at the time. Doesn't mean it was the right account, but this was the account recorded. That same evening, the local milkman, Maurice Helm, had stopped to urinate in what he believed was a secluded spot. Some girls ran across him unexpectedly, shrieked when they saw his ding-a-ling, and fled. Helm later came forward, admitted what had happened, and the police accepted his explanation. It was embarrassing rather than sinister. It was just unfortunate timing. However, before Helm identified himself, officers had already began tying the youth club reports together. So they had these reports from these girls about some guy dropping their trousers and exposing themselves. They had the report about the milkman, who they didn't realise at the time was the milkman and he was just urinating. They thought it was sinister, and they were just tying these little things together and coming up with their own conclusions. Because the issue was, he didn't come forward at first, worried that they wouldn't believe his account, which, I mean, they probably wouldn't have. He did come forward, but, he just didn't come forward straight away. Other children present that night described a man loitering around the estate, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes near the club, sometimes by the road. Their recollections varied wildly. Some thought he carried a knife, others mentioned a suspicious car. And basically, the physical descriptions of this so-called perpetrator also varied wildly between the children. But despite these inconsistencies, these sightings fed a growing belief that a local flasher was operating in the area. The second significant incident occurred the following afternoon on Saturday, the 4th of October 1975. Two teenagers, Maxine Buckley and her friend Deborah Mills, left the youth club and reported seeing a man in a green parka standing and staring at them. They told the police he opened his coat and exposed himself before running away. Maxine believed that she recognised him and ran home and told her mother. Police went to the house that she identified, but no one was in. The turning point came on bonfire night, the 5th of November 1975. So this is now slightly after Lesley was murdered. Maxine was walking home when she saw a man approaching her in the dark. Terrified, she convinced herself that this was the same man who had frightened her and Deborah the month previously. And so she ran home, told her mother, who then drove her, back around the estate. And this time, the man that she had pointed out was at home. His name was Stefan Kiszko. Now, this man, Stefan, was not the same man that she had seen the previous month. But the problem was, once she identified the man that she believed she had seen on the 4th of October, the investigation reshaped itself around her mistake. Once Stefan was in the police's sights, every other lead, including the description of the man on the moor, i.e., the real killer, the one that Christopher Coverdale had seen taking Lesley by the hand up the moor, all of these accounts were pushed aside. Detectives convinced themselves that Lesley's killer was also the local flasher. And Stefan had been identified as the local flasher, which he wasn't. In the eyes of the inquiry, he was no longer just the man Maxine had seen on bonfire night. He became the man from the 4th of October, and by extension, the man from the 3rd of October that the other girls had seen, and by extension, the man who had killed Lesley. Separate incidents were now treated as one continuous series, and Stefan was positioned as the common thread. From this point on, Stefan Kiszko became the primary focus of the inquiry, a decision that would shape everything that followed. So let's take a little look at Stefan Kiszko. Stefan was a tax clerk who lived nearby with his mother. He was born in 1952 to parents Ivan and Charlotte Kiszko, who had emigrated to the United Kingdom from Eastern Europe after the Second World War. Stefan had been a sickly child, suffering from chronic asthma and eczema, and he grew up socially isolated. He struggled to keep up physically with other children. He missed long stretches of school due to illness, and he never really formed close friendships. Teachers later described him as a quiet, gentle boy who kept himself to himself. As an adult, he remained socially awkward and emotionally immature, with assessments showing he had the mental and emotional development of a young teenager. Now, Stefan's father died 5 years earlier, suffering a heart attack in the street, collapsing at Stefan's feet. So now it was just him and his mother, and they were very, very close. He had no real social life, and he avoided social activities, preferring to stay at home. In the community, he was seen as a harmless but slightly odd young man who always carried a bag of sweets in his pocket, which made him popular with local children but misunderstood by adults. People didn't understand Stefan or his disabilities. They simply saw him as strange. And to the girls, he seemed like someone who could be capable of something sinister. Now, as you can see, these are all characteristics that made him seem that little bit different to other people, a little bit odd. The kind of narrative that the police at the time would have jumped on. Stefan had learning difficulties and a limited understanding of the world, and this made him especially vulnerable during questioning, which he was going to be getting a lot of. And once Stefan's name entered the investigation, confirmation bias took hold. His quiet demeanour, his solitary habits, and his learning difficulties were all seen as signs of deviance. I have seen some sources say that he might have been on the autism spectrum. Now, that is pure speculation. He was never diagnosed, but it does give a kind of modern day understanding of the kind of character that he was. When the police searched his home and car, they found pornographic magazines and a packet of sweets. Now, these items, entirely legal items, were presented as evidence that he might have used them to lure a child. The police also found a notebook containing meticulously recorded car registration numbers, which Stefan collected as a harmless hobby, kind of like train spotting or something. He collected car registration numbers. And investigators twisted what they could about Stefan to fit their narrative and interpreted this as evidence that he had been scouting vehicles or locations. In other words, he wasn't just writing down number plates because that was his hobby, but he was scouting vehicles or locations to abduct a child. He wasn't, but they were trying to fit anything that they found about him to fit the narrative that they wanted him to fit into. On the 21st of December 1975, less than 3 months after Lesley's murder, the police arrested Stefan Kiszko. He was taken to Rochdale Police Station for questioning. Now, Stefan was not equipped to withstand the interrogation that he faced. He was questioned for 3 days without a solicitor present. He repeatedly asked for his mother, his only real source of emotional support, but his requests were denied. The protections that we now take for granted under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984 simply didn't exist yet. He wasn't properly cautioned, he had only a limited understanding of his rights, and his learning difficulties made him vulnerable to suggestion. Now, Stefan was also physically unwell. He suffered from hypogonadism, and he required regular testosterone injections. In the weeks before his arrest, he had been receiving regular injections as part of ongoing medical treatment, and these left him drowsy, anxious, and mentally foggy, something that he mentioned repeatedly during questioning. Now, we will go into his condition a little later, and it is really significant to the case, but for now, officers didn't really have all the details. They just knew enough that it would make him act a little bit confused at times. However, whenever Stefan became confused or contradicted himself or struggled to follow the police's questions, they treated it as evidence that he was lying rather than a sign of his impaired state. This mental haze was exploited to link Stefan to the series of flashing incidents by first pressuring Stefan into a formal confession for these indecent exposures. They effectively trapped him in the narrative of being a sexual predator. So they coerced him into confessing. You exposed yourself, didn't you? You were outside the youth club, weren't you? So you can imagine, if you've got officers sitting there screaming that at you, you're going to be like, yeah, okay, whatever, just stop, it was me. And that's basically what they did. Then with this admission secured, they could then go a step up from flasher to murderer, bridging the gap to the ultimate charge that they were after, Lesley's murder. Now, I don't think the milkman had come forward at this point during the interrogation, so I believe the police were genuinely connecting the flashing incidents and using the girls as statements. But the girls had lied or exaggerated what happened, as we now know. But it still doesn't excuse the fact that when the milkman does come forward, the police are so tunnel-visioned in making everything fit Stefan that they essentially ignore the milkman. They don't backtrack and go, sorry, Stefan, we made a mistake. They kind of just push the milkman to the side. Plus, they used dodgy techniques to get Stefan to confess in the first place. He was subjected to hours of leading questions, contradictions, pressure, with no meaningful breaks, no legal support, no understanding of the process that he was trapped in. For instance, where did you stab Lesley? In the back or the neck? Very leading. It wasn't like, okay, so what happened that day? It was basically giving the information, but without giving the information. Officers fed Stefan the details of the crime, some of which also leaked within the police force. So basically, he overheard officers speaking about the crime. So that was why he knew the details and knew some of the facts, because he overheard the police talking about it. So basically, when he repeated what he had heard back, they treated it as proof of guilt. When he didn't know an answer, when he said, his memory was hazy, which it was because he was having this treatment, basically the officers kind of filled in the gaps for him. Each moment of confusion was used to increase the pressure, pushing him closer to saying, whatever they wanted to hear. He was exhausted, he was hungry, he was thirsty, he was even vomiting at one point. During his questioning, he was even driven to the lay-by on the moors where Lesley's body had been found. Under the intense strain of being at the scene, Stefan began to say he heard voices, a detail the police interpreted as a psychological breakthrough or a sign of his internal guilt. In reality, it was the sound of a man's mind fraying and just 72 hours of interrogation. Now, it was a few days before Christmas. Stefan wanted to go home. He wanted his mother. And Stefan believed that if he just cooperated with the police, that they would let him go home. And so under this immense pressure, frightened and desperate for this ordeal to end, Stefan eventually broke down and confessed to a murder that he did not commit. Now, he did go on to later retract the confession as soon as he received legal advice. And when he was asked why he had admitted to something he didn't do, he explained, "I started to tell these lies, and they seemed to please them, and the pressure was off as far as I was concerned. I thought if I admitted what I did to police, they would check out what I said, find it untrue, and would let me go." Basically, he was responding to the fact that they seemed pleased when he said something that they wanted to hear. So he kept trying to please them, thinking they would let him go home. But he had confessed, and by then, the damage had been done. The investigation had become a tunnel vision pursuit of a single suspect, and the police considered the case solved. They had a suspect, a written confession, and a narrative that seemed to fit. And on Christmas Eve 1975, while other families were preparing for the holidays, Stefan Kiszko was charged with Lesley Molseed's murder, a murder that he did not commit. When the trial began in July 1976 at Leeds Crown Court, Stefan Kiszko was already at a profound disadvantage. His awkward manner and limited social understanding were interpreted by the jury not as fear or vulnerability, but as signs of guilt. The prosecution portrayed Stefan as a sexually deviant loner who had targeted a vulnerable child. They claimed that because his delayed development meant he was emotionally equivalent to a 12-year-old, his mind was naturally attracted to those he most related to. Once the hormone injections he was getting allowed him to feel sexual attraction and gratification, he directed those urges towards children. To reinforce this, they relied on the indecent exposure allegations, including the testimony from the girls who had seen the milkman Maurice Helm. The jury was never told that Helm had already come forward to explain the incident. Instead, the prosecution presented these sightings as proof of Stefan's apparently escalating sexual motive. I.e., he was a vulnerable man with learning difficulties, therefore he must be sexually deviant. They relied heavily on the confession extracted during the days of oppressive questioning, presenting it as a genuine admission rather than the product of intimidation, exhaustion, and a vulnerable man trying to appease authority figures. The jury never heard that Stefan had repeatedly begged for his mother, nor that had no solicitor been present, nor that he had retracted the confession at the first opportunity. Even Stefan's alibi, which should have protected him, was used as a weapon against him. Now, we haven't touched on the alibi yet, but basically he had been at home with his mother on the afternoon of the murder. However, months of pressure, confusion, and repeated questioning had tangled it by the police. So by the time he reached the dock, he was testifying to a visit to Rochdale Cemetery that had actually happened a week later. So he confused the time, but that's because he was so confused that he kind of was confessing to a different incident that happened at a different time. And then what happened was the prosecution then seized on this mistake, portraying a confused man's memory lapse as a calculated and desperate lie, which it wasn't. He was just confused. So in the end, the prosecution's narrative ended up looking like the stronger argument. And they argued that Stefan had ample time to leave the house, drive to the moors, commit the murder, and return unnoticed. Now, this theory was then anchored to what the police had claimed was definitive physical proof of his presence at the scene. The evidence in question was a registration number found in Stefan's car spotting notebook. Detectives highlighted an entry written in red ink, claiming it had been noted down at the lay-by on the day of the murder. Because a car with that same registration had been reported near the area, finding a match in Stefan's notebook provided the physical link the investigation needed. It was an entirely tenuous claim. The police had no proof of when Stefan had actually recorded that number down, yet they presented the red ink as a guilty marker. In reality, there was no evidence to suggest that the entry was anything more than a coincidence from a hobbyist's log. Basically, they were jumping on little things that might suggest something, but not actually properly doing their jobs and proving it. There was no evidence that he took that number down at the scene on the day, and you'll come to find out that he didn't. But that's what they were doing. Now, you remember when the police were scouring the moors, just picking up anything, rubbish and pens. There was a pen found near Lesley's body that happened to be similar to the type of pen used by Stefan at his workplace. Really? But yet, it was used as evidence, though it carried no fingerprints, no biological material, and no forensic trace to prove that Stefan had ever even touched it. Now, the forensic investigator did find yellow wool fibres and an orange rayon fibre on Lesley's clothing, which, we touched on at the start. And as part of the investigation, Kiszko's car was examined, and there was a mat on the floor that had come from a stair carpet gifted by his aunt. Now, the remnant of the carpet contained yellow wool fibres and orange rayon fibres, which enabled the forensic investigator to say that his findings were consistent with Lesley Molseed having been a passenger in Stefan's car. But the thing is, these fibres, they're not like DNA samples. They're very, very commonplace and can be found almost everywhere. Forensic investigator Ronald did actually admit that the only reason he submitted the fibres as evidence is because of Stefan's confession. The fibre evidence by itself was valueless. So if Stefan hadn't confessed, it was so ridiculously valueless evidence, he wouldn't have even submitted it. He just was like, oh, there you go, there's something that it could tie it to him. Ridiculous. So basically, most of this trial is based around Stefan's confession, which meant nothing considering the circumstances under which he confessed. So these everyday commonplace items were presented as if they were significant evidence to fit the prosecution's theory. But ultimately, nothing was found that could prove he had ever been in contact with Lesley. Now, this is a big one. Hold on to your hats for this one. This is a massive betrayal of justice and occurred with the forensic evidence, which should have cleared Stefan immediately. This evidence was proof that Stefan did not kill Lesley. It's forensic, it's scientific, but that's no good if it's suppressed. And it was suppressed. While it was already known that Stefan had a medical condition called hypogonadism, and for which he had been receiving regular testosterone injections before his arrest, the full forensic implications of his condition were only confirmed through medical reports prepared for the trial. These reports proved he had azoospermia, meaning he was medically incapable of producing sperm. However, the forensic analysis of Lesley's clothing showed the presence of spermatozoa, i.e. sperm heads. Since Stefan suffered from azoospermia, he could not have been the source. The killer was a fertile man. Stefan was not fertile. The semen on Lesley's body, I said at the beginning, was significant because it had the sperm heads. That semen could not have come from Stefan because he could not produce the sperm heads. This single physical fact should have ruled Stefan out as Lesley's killer straight away. The end. Finito. Case dismissed. Go home to your mother. Sorry for the absolute hell you've been through. Have an amazing life. Stefan couldn't have done any of this. So at the time of the 1976 trial, the specific fact that the semen found on Lesley's clothing contained sperm heads was withheld not only from the defence, but also from the judge and the jury. The senior forensic scientist, Ronald, had recorded the presence of these spermatozoa in his private lab notes. Yet, he omitted this detail from his official witness statement, using the vague term semen instead. And so this is why the defence didn't realise the significance of the presence of the sperm heads, that it meant that one person was fertile whilst the other one wasn't, because the word semen is generic. If Outteridge had specifically said spermatozoa, the defence could have made that connection. Now, the prosecution knew this. They knew what it meant, but they didn't disclose it. The prosecution ensured that the trial was never about a search for truth, but a performance designed to validate a false confession and get the outcome they had been so tunnel-visioned on receiving. I don't think the people that knew about this, Dick Holland from the police, the prosecution, and Outteridge, the forensic scientists, necessarily conspired together. There was no kind of backroom secret meetings. At least I don't think there was. I don't know. It's more likely that these people as individuals all wanted to win. And so they all just kept quiet. And staying silent about the truth is just as bad as a lie. I think they also genuinely believed that Stefan was guilty, so they weren't deliberately trying to frame an innocent man. They were trying to make evidence fit somebody they considered to be a guilty man. So yeah, now the prosecution have a problem in that they knew they had to be prepared just in case the defence realised the significance of the sperm heads. So they performed kind of like a preemptive strike. They didn't know if the defence understood it or not. Now, the defence hadn't understood it and they didn't bring it up. But the prosecution weren't aware of that. And they wanted to be ready with kind of excuses just in case the defence did bring it up. And so they kind of planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the judge and the jury of alternative explanations of why there could have been semen that didn't belong to Stefan on Lesley's body. And the suggestion that they planted to the court was disgraceful. They suggested that the sperm might have come from an earlier sexual encounter involving Lesley and another man. Lesley was 11 years old. So they were saying that she consensually slept with somebody before Stefan, and that would be why there would be, semen found on her body. Now, Stefan's home defence team compounded the damage. They pursued a diminished responsibility argument, something Stefan had not agreed to. Rather than fighting for his total innocence, they went along with the idea that he might have murdered Lesley. But they said that if he did murder her, It may have been because his hormone treatment impaired his control. This was medically baseless, ludicrous, and coming from a team that was supposed to be defending Stefan. His endocrinologist could have stated that testosterone therapy did not cause violent or sexual behaviour, but this witness was never actually called to testify. They even pointed to the adult magazines found in Stefan's car as evidence of sexual immaturity, using them to support their diminished responsibility argument. The defence's strategy implied he might have committed the murder, but was somehow responsible because of the hormone treatment. To be fair, it wasn't entirely the defence's fault, as they didn't have all the evidence. Had they understood the significance of the sperm heads, they could have used that evidence. But as it was, they didn't understand that Stefan was infertile while the killer was fertile. And so I guess they were trying to soften the blow, believing that he was going to go down for this. So they were just trying to somehow make the sentence, better for him. But, if he wasn't going to go down before, he was now because of the defence's strategy. It left the jury with the impression that Stefan's own legal team didn't even believe that he was innocent. On the 21st of July 1976, after 5.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a majority verdict of 10-2 guilty. Stefan was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge praised the police for their work and commended the officers involved. He also praised the teenage girls who had lied that Stefan had exposed himself to them, describing them as brave and honest. The mother of one of the girls said that Stefan should have been arrested sooner and called for him to be hanged. But it just shows what a good job the police and the prosecution did at twisting the narrative. And it's not that they were concealing the evidence, it's just that they were distracting people away from it. People believed that Stefan was a monster. Imagine this was somewhere where the death penalty could have been an option. And it's the reason why, if there was a vote tomorrow, I would say no to the death penalty. I agree with the death penalty in principle. I do agree with the principle of it. But in practice, no way. Because of cases like this. Because the truth was, an innocent man had been convicted on the basis of lies, flawed forensic interpretation, and a confession extracted under duress. And it also meant that the real killer, there was still a real killer out there somewhere, remained free. The justice system had just committed one of the most devastating miscarriages of justice in British history. Stefan entered the prison system as a man with the mental age of a child, with no understanding of what awaited him. For someone convicted of a sexual murder of a child, it was especially dangerous. Word spread quickly about the nature of his conviction, and he became a target for abuse, threats, and violence. And usually, we wouldn't care too much. But Stefan was innocent. He was attacked several times, receiving constant death threats. He was punched, kicked, and spat upon. On one occasion, he needed 17 stitches in his head after being struck with a mop handle. Stefan struggled to comprehend why this was happening. His learning difficulties made it hard for him to understand the rules and the routines of prison life, and he often appeared withdrawn or anxious. As the years passed, Stefan's mental health deteriorated. He developed symptoms of severe depression and psychosis, including delusions and hallucinations. He struggled to sleep, and he became emotionally unstable. But through it all, Stefan never wavered in his insistence that he was innocent. 3 years into his sentence, he launched an appeal, but this was dismissed. The appeal system of the time was designed to protect jury verdicts, not correct them, which meant the court saw no reason to revisit the scientific contradictions that should have cleared Stefan, which is mad. And then, adding salt to the wound, Stefan continually saying he was innocent was seen by the authorities as further evidence of delusional thinking. So there was nothing he could do. He was told that any chance of parole would require him to admit to murdering Lesley. And of course, he wasn't going to admit to murdering Lesley. He refused, choosing to remain behind bars rather than confess to a crime he did not commit. In 1990, so after 15 years or so in prison, Stefan was told that his first parole hearing would take place in December in 1992, but release would only be considered if he admitted to the murder and convinced the parole board he was not a danger to children. He continued to protest his innocence, and his mental health deteriorated further. I'm not surprised, 15 years in prison for a crime you didn't commit. By March 1991, after years of delays and repeated recommendations that he receive psychiatric care, he was finally transferred to Ashworth Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility under the Mental Health Act. Ashworth offered a more therapeutic environment, but the damage had already been done. He had severe depression, was physically and emotionally shattered. He had developed diabetes. 16 years in prison for a crime he could not have committed had left him physically and psychologically broken. So Stefan's mother, Charlotte, travelled long distances to visit Stefan, witnessing firsthand his physical and mental decline. Each visit left her heartbroken, but it strengthened her resolve. From the moment the jury convicted Stefan, Charlotte refused to accept it. And it's about time that we talk about this wonderful lady. She had been with him on the day Lesley disappeared, and she knew his gentle, naive nature better than anyone. To be fair, I think most parents, would think that about their kids, and you can see why the police and prosecution would be dubious about familial alibis. But as we know, Stefan was innocent. Charlotte knew Stefan could not fight for himself, so she dedicated the rest of her life to fighting for him, beginning a determined campaign to prove that her son had been wrongfully imprisoned. The problem was convincing everybody else, but her determination was extraordinary. This was, honest to God, one strong woman. Charlotte had grown up in Eastern Europe under the communist regime. She was 24 years old and alone when she fled to the UK, and she was no stranger to determination. She wrote to anyone that she believed might help. She approached her local MP, Sir Cyril Smith, but he ignored her pleas. She wrote to Prime Minister James Callaghan and later to Margaret Thatcher, but neither intervened. She contacted journalists, solicitors, organisations that supported victims of miscarriages of justice, hoping, praying that someone would listen. Most of her letters went unanswered. Others received kind of a polite but dismissive reply. The case had been hailed as a police success, and few people were willing to question it. But despite this lack of progress, Charlotte never, ever gave up on her son. For years, she campaigned alone until 1984, when she contacted the human rights organisation Justice. This proved to be a turning point. Justice reviewed the case and immediately recognised serious concerns about the evidence used to convict Stefan. They believed the forensic findings, the confession, and the police investigation all required urgent re-examination. Their involvement finally gave Charlotte the support she had been denied for so long. After years of carrying the truth alone, finally, others were carrying it with her. In 1987, solicitor Campbell Malone agreed to take on Stefan's case. Working alongside Philip Clegg, who had been the junior defence counsel at the original trial, and supported by private investigator Peter Jackson, the team began reviewing the evidence and the circumstances of the original investigation. Over the next few years, they compiled their concerns into a detailed petition for the Home Secretary, which was submitted in 1990. And finally, the case was reopened in February 1991. The case was then handed to Detective Chief Superintendent Trevor Wilkinson of West Yorkshire Police. Now, Wilkinson approached the reinvestigation with objectivity. Basically, he had a lot to prove to the Molseed family that the West Yorkshire Police weren't completely useless. Between the work of Malone's team and the findings of the police review, the truth eventually became impossible to ignore. As we know, evidence that should have protected Stefan had been overlooked, misunderstood, or suppressed. The key points being the confession, the centerpiece of the original 1976 case, was revealed to be a hollow shell. Stefan had been subjected to 3 days of relentless, oppressive questioning, facing hundreds of leading questions designed to trap him. Wilkinson discovered that the guilty knowledge the prosecution relied on, details supposedly only the killer would have known, was a fabrication. These details, as I said earlier, hadn't come from Stefan's memory of killing Lesley. They had been fed to him through the police's own leading questions or overheard by Stefan as officers discussed the case within earshot in the station. Basically, details of the murder, such as the location of the body and the specific injuries, were being discussed openly by officers in hallways and offices where Stefan was being held or moved. Crazy. A significant discovery by the 1991 reinvestigation team involved a massive bundle of evidence comprising thousands of pages that the prosecution had served to the defence on the very morning the trial began. Overwhelmed by the volume of this paperwork, and on the morning of the trial, the defence failed to ask for an adjournment to review it. However, buried deep within that pile was a crucial statement from Maurice Helm, the local milkman, who was at the centre of the youth club flashing incidents. Events the original investigation had used to paint Stefan as a sexual predator and to which some of Stefan's coerced confessions referred. The reinvestigation revealed that Helm had actually gone to the police long before the actual trial to explain that the girls had seen him innocently urinating. Although the police investigated Helm and cleared him, they never drew the defence's attention to his statement. So it was all just lost in this paperwork. Had Stefan's lawyers found this needle in the haystack, they could have provided an innocent explanation for the sightings and proven that the girls had misidentified Stefan from the start. It was also discovered that during the incident on the 4th of October 1975, in which Maxine Buckley and her friend Deborah Mills had reported seeing a man in a green parka open his coat and expose himself before running away, that not only did Stefan not own such a coat, but he had a long-standing leg injury, which meant he was physically incapable of running from the scene in the manner that the girls described. The women involved in the flashing allegations, all in their 30s by this point, by the point of the reinvestigation, were re-interviewed in 1991 and admitted they had lied or exaggerated their accounts. So basically, had they just come forward with the truth, it could have released Stefan. Although saying that, I mean, the police, as we know, were pretty fixated on putting him away. Maxine Buckley told the reinvestigation team that she knew Stefan Kiszko and that he had not been the man involved in the earlier sightings. Catherine Burke acknowledged that she had never seen a man expose himself and had not heard any threat. Pamela Hind admitted that she had not seen the man's penis and had simply repeated what others had said. Debbie Brown also admitted that she had lied along with her friends, later reflecting, "As a young girl, I had a vivid imagination and frequently made up stories about things." Now look, I have seen in some sources, some of the girls said they did it for a laugh. One of them said she didn't think at the time that things would go as far as they did. And as infuriating as that is, and as cross as people feel with the girls, ultimately, this is the police's fault. I've seen a lot of blame towards the girls, and that's completely understandable, and I'm pissed off with them as well. I don't want to say they were young and naive as an excuse, because, yeah, they should have known better. But they were young. And I think a lot of understanding consequences comes from lived experiences. So while, yeah, they should have known better, I think their age can be taken into account. The grown-ups in this situation were the police, and they're the ones that should have done better. Catherine Burke and Pamela Hind were cautioned by the police for making false statements to the authorities. Now we are on to the most devastating and frustrating part of the case. This is where investigators looked at the original forensic lab books from 1975, and they saw the handwritten notes from Ronald Outeridge, the forensic investigator, and where he had clearly recorded the presence of sperm heads while omitting this detail from his formal witness statement, which used the vague term semen instead. The reinvestigation got a new forensic scientist to re-examine the original microscope slides from the 1975 investigation and confirmed that the sperm heads were clearly visible as they had been 16 years previously. So yeah, the police and the prosecution had always known Stefan's medical condition meant he produced no sperm, but had sat on this evidence for over a decade. They knew from day one that the biology did not match, yet they let him rot in a cell, subjected to beatings and psychosis, rather than reveal the truth. The reinvestigation also systematically dismantled the smaller pieces of evidence that had been used to trap Stefan. One of the most glaring failures involved the red ink car registration number found in Stefan's notebook. The police claimed that it proved that Stefan was at the scene on that day. But they traced the vehicle's previous owner and discovered it had regularly been parked in the same car park that Stefan used for his work. It was simply another example of Stefan's habit of noting down car registration numbers that bothered him, recorded long before Lesley was even missing. The physical impossibility of the prosecution's timeline was further confirmed by the medical experts. Stefan's GP, Dr. DeVaz, told the reinvestigation team that Stefan's mobility was severely limited due to a broken ankle sustained just a year before the murder. This was why he couldn't have been the flasher that the girls saw running away. He stated that he had never been asked by the original investigators about Stefan's ability to climb the steep embankment where Lesley was found. I mean, if he couldn't run away, then he wasn't going to be able to climb the bloody moors, was he? Had the doctor been called to testify, he would have told the jury that the prosecution's version of events was physically impossible for a man in Stefan's condition. Remember Christopher Coverdale, the man who was driving past the lay-by and saw who he believed was Lesley with a man? Well, that man did not fit Stefan's description. The person that this man saw was much shorter, around about 5'6". Stefan was a tall man, around about 6'2". This was a detail that would have immediately directed the police's attention elsewhere. Equally damaging was the silence of Stefan's hormone specialist. During the original trial, the prosecution had portrayed Stefan's testosterone injections as a trigger for sexual aggression. The 1991 investigation confirmed that the specialist could have easily debunked this as medically baseless. Not only would this have undermined the prosecution, but it would have also stopped Stefan's own defence team from pursuing their disastrous and unapproved argument of diminished responsibility. So by 1991, it was clear that every safeguard intended to protect the innocent had been bypassed to secure a conviction at any cost. And the evidence now pointed in only one direction. Stefan Kiszko could not have been the killer. And on the 17th of February 1992, the Court of Appeal heard the new evidence. The hearing was brief, lasting less than an hour. The evidence uncovered by the 1991 team was so undeniable that the Crown Prosecution Service did not offer any opposition. Lord Chief Justice Lane stated plainly, "It has been shown that this man cannot produce sperm. This man consequently cannot have been the murderer." The conviction was quashed and Stefan was ordered to be released immediately. Charlotte had won. After 16 years of wrongful imprisonment, Stefan was finally a free man. However, the man who walked out of the Royal Courts of Justice was a shell of the man he once was. He was taken back to the hospital for further psychiatric treatment, and it would be 12 weeks before he was finally strong enough to return home.
I'm very upset about Kiszko serving 16 years in prison for the murder he didn't do. There's somewhere out there there's a man who killed my sister, and the police, I hope to God they catch him, because I'll never rest until they do.
The case raised serious questions about police conduct, forensic reliability, and the treatment of vulnerable suspects. Newspapers condemned the failures that had led to Stefan's conviction, and commentators called for accountability. In 1994, it looked as though the accountability might happen when Detective Superintendent Dick Holland, who had led the original murder inquiry, and Ronald Outridge, the lead forensic investigator, were charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice for suppressing evidence that could have cleared Stefan. However, there's always a but. In a final insult to the Kiszko family, the proceedings were stayed in 1995. The court ruled that the passage of time made a fair trial impossible. An ironic justification considering the 16 years Stefan had spent waiting for his own version of fairness. I mean, come on. They're worried about their fairness. What about Stefan's fairness? No one was ever held legally accountable for the failures that led to Stefan's wrongful conviction. Disgusting. For Lesley Molseed's family, Stefan's exoneration was a second trauma. For 16 years, they had lived with the certainty that her killer was behind bars. Now they had to face the reality that the real monster had been free all along. In an extraordinary act of reconciliation, the Molseed and Kiszko families came together for the first time. Lesley's father, Frederick Anderson, apologised to Charlotte for the anger he had directed at her over the years. Charlotte, bless her, she's lovely. She harboured no ill will. She expressed her deep sympathy for the loss of his daughter, saying, "I never blame the family for what happened to Stefan. I have got my son back, but that little girl can never be replaced." And I love Charlotte for that, because I think, everybody became so wrapped up, and rightly so, wrapped up in Stefan and the injustice that he went through, that kind of what happened to Lesley kind of gets forgotten. And so, Charlotte saying that little girl can never come back, I think is spot on. For Stefan and Charlotte, their priority was simply trying to rebuild a life that had been stolen from them. Stefan did his best to remain hopeful and reclaim the opportunities he had missed. He spoke of marriage, holidays, and the chances to see the world.
My hopes for the future: to get married, go on holiday and enjoy my life as much as I can.
And although he was eventually awarded around £500,000 in compensation, the legal process was slow and he only ever received an interim payment. And sadly, he never got to see the rest of the money. On the 23rd of December 1993, less than 2 years after his release, Stefan died of a heart attack at the age of 41. Stefan would never get to do the things he dreamed of. Less than 2 years after his release, let that sink in. Everything that this poor man had been through, it's so incredibly tragic. Charlotte, the woman whose tireless love had moved mountains, died 4 months after Stefan in 1994. She had spent 16 years fighting to bring her son home, only to lose him a mere 22 months after his release. The year before her death, Charlotte's tireless campaigning had been formally recognised when she was named Rochdale Woman of the Year. Without her persistence, Stefan would almost certainly have died in prison, his innocence never recognised. Charlotte and Stefan are buried together in Rochdale Cemetery. Their graves stand as a testament to a mother's unwavering love and a son's unimaginable suffering. Neither got to see the real killer ever identified. When Stefan Kiszko's conviction was overturned in 1992, the question of who had murdered Lesley Molseed returned to the same place it had began in October 1975, back to square one. The reinvestigation exposed the failures of the original inquiry, but it hadn't identified the real killer. Detective Chief Superintendent Trevor Wilkinson continued to pursue lines of inquiry. The case remained open, but made little progress. Without modern DNA profiling, detectives simply didn't have the tools that they needed. So, let's fast forward to early 2000s, and the murder inquiry was formally relaunched as a cold case and handed to Detective Chief Superintendent Max McLean of West Yorkshire Police. One of the most significant developments was the advancement of forensic science. So in 1975, DNA profiling didn't exist. By the early 2000s, it had become a powerful tool for identifying suspects and excluding the innocent. Detectives hoped that the semen found on Lesley's clothing might now identify the real killer. But when they attempted to send the clothing for testing, they discovered that it had been destroyed in 1985, 10 years after the murder. Because, no one ever imagined that the evidence was going to be needed again. Fortunately, not everything had been lost. Now, do you remember when they were on the moors using the adhesive tape to lift fibres from Lesley's clothing before all the evidence blew away? Well, they had 2 small pieces left that had been stored separately and survived. Just 2 pieces. These overlooked tapings were sent for modern forensic testing. Because the strips were so fragile and the testing process would destroy them, forensic scientists only had 1 chance with each strip. If the tests failed, the evidence was gone forever. Thankfully, scientists found semen on them, and they were able to obtain a full DNA profile of the perpetrator. For the first time, the police had a genetic fingerprint of Lesley's killer. The profile was circulated through the UK National DNA Database. It was sent to Interpol, so it could be checked internationally against international records. There was no matches though. Nothing was found. As the years passed, the case remained open and the DNA profile was checked regularly against new entries in the national database. But still no matches were found. Then, in October 2005, the breakthrough that everybody was desperate for finally arrived. It followed the arrest of a 53-year-old man in Oldham, just 7 miles away from Rochdale. He had been detained following an allegation made by a sex worker. The law had recently changed, allowing DNA samples to be kept from anyone arrested for a recordable offence. So although this man was never charged for that specific incident, his DNA was taken. His sample was entered into the national database. It matched the DNA from Lesley Molseed's case. The man was 53-year-old Ronald Castree. After 30 years, the hunt for Lesley's killer had finally reached its end. So who was Ronald Castree? He was born on the 18th of October 1953 in Littleborough, Greater Manchester. He was the only child of Eric and Marjorie Castree. His mother doted on him, believing he could do no wrong, while his father was the opposite. He was critical and bullying and emotionally abusive. Eric himself had a conviction, Castree's father had a conviction for indecency towards a child. So basically, his son Ronald would turn out the same. In 1973, when Ronald was 19, he met 16-year-old Beverly. They married soon after. 2 years later, Beverly gave birth to a son, Jason. Now, Jason was the result of an affair and not Ronald's biological child. But even so, Ronald agreed to raise him as his own. On the 3rd of October 1975, just days after Jason's birth, Beverly developed deep vein thrombosis and was admitted to hospital. 2 days after she was admitted, 11-year-old Lesley Molseed disappeared and was murdered. It is believed that Castree encountered Lesley while travelling to visit his wife in the hospital. The police believe the motive for attacking Lesley was he was angry that his wife had just given birth to another man's child. Right. Leave your wife. Beverly had no idea what her husband had done, and because the police quickly focused on Stefan Kiszko, Castree slipped beneath the radar entirely. Now, as is so typical in many of these cases, his escape from justice allowed him to offend again. Just 3 weeks before Stefan Kiszko's murder trial began in July 1976, Castree abducted a 9-year-old girl who lived near Lesley's home in Rochdale. He kidnapped her, took her to an abandoned house, and sexually assaulted her. The girl managed to escape, and Castree was arrested and charged with gross indecency and indecent assault. He pleaded guilty, though astonishingly, he wasn't imprisoned. He was fined £25, roughly about £700 in today's money. I have no words. He has just assaulted this little girl and he is fined £25. Castree was working as a taxi driver at the time, a job that allowed him to move around the area without attracting suspicion. 2 years later, in July 1978, he assaulted a young boy and was again charged with indecent assault, and once more he received a £25 fine. Despite 2 convictions for sexual offences against children in as many years, he avoided prison entirely. Now, they obviously don't know that he murdered Lesley, but what the hell? This man should not have been on the streets or allowed anywhere near children. They had him twice, but he was released. Now, Beverly was aware of one of the convictions, yet the couple went on to have 2 more children, Nick and Daniel. So this kind of disgusted me at first, the fact that she stayed with him, let alone had more children with him. The instinct is that I would not want my child around someone who has been convicted of abusing a child. But the thing was, she had all this pressure from his parents who were telling her he made a mistake. It's out of character. He's working too hard. Plus, importantly, there was fear and control in this relationship, and that helps to explain her actions. So, their son Nick would later speak publicly about the violence and fear that defined their childhood. Ronald regularly beat Beverly, leaving her bruised and terrified. He punished her for things he believed she did wrong, such as not cleaning properly or not cooking to his standards, and on one occasion broke her nose over these perceived failings. Throughout their marriage, Ronald was openly unfaithful. He used sex workers, he had affairs, and he made no attempt to hide it. He derived sexual pleasure from violence and acts of bondage and pressured Beverly into things that she did not want to do and found degrading. I read things like he made her dress up like a schoolgirl and he'd pretend to molest her. Says a lot, doesn't it? When she refused his demands, he would tell her and the children that he was going out to find a woman to sleep with, and Beverly never dared to argue. Basically, this man is vile, and you can see he was disgusting enough to take a vulnerable little girl who was simply running an errand for her mother. Nick also described the emotional abuse that he endured, including homophobic slurs that intensified as he grew older when he realized he was gay. Bless Nick. He's done a few interviews and has been quite honest about the abuse that the family went through. Tragically, the abuse Nick experienced extended beyond his father. Nick later revealed that during his teenage years, he had been sexually abused by his grandfather, Eric Castree, who we know had a conviction for indecency towards a child. He's since wondered whether Ronald might have actually been abused by Eric as well, and whether that contributed to the man that Ronald became. I would say so, but obviously it's speculation. After 2 decades of abuse, Beverly finally left Ronald in 1996. While Ronald was working at the comic book shop that he now owned, which incidentally Nick thought might actually be a cover to lure children because kids like comics, and that sounds plausible. Anyway, whilst he's working at this comic shop, Beverly, Nick and Daniel packed their belongings into Nick's car and fled. They moved into a rented house and began rebuilding their lives without him. Almost 10 years later, in 2005, Ronald married another woman and moved into her home in Shaw Oldham, becoming stepfather to her 3 children, which just is very concerning. But the facade of this new life didn't last. Later that year, in October 2005, was when Ronald's DNA was taken following his arrest after an allegation made by a sex worker. His DNA was taken and entered into the national database, and when it was uploaded, it matched the semen recovered from the sellotape, the adhesive tape taken from Lesley Molseed's clothing in 1975. The match was unequivocal. An innocent man suffered in prison, while Castree, that horrible, vile, disgusting man, had lived freely, reoffended, raised and abused a family. It's frustrating as hell as well, because if the police hadn't been so focused on Stefan, they might have seen Castree. He lived locally at the time of the murder. He'd been working as a taxi driver, a job that allowed him to move around the area without attracting suspicion. Most damningly, Castree had been arrested for abducting and assaulting a 9-year-old girl in July 1976, less than a year after Lesley's death. Despite this being a near identical crime in the same area, he was never considered a suspect. Police's tunnel vision protected Ronald Castree.
Are you Ronald Charles Edward Castree?
I am.
Right, listen very carefully to what I've got to say to you now. You were under arrest for the murder of Lesley Susan Molseed
You're joking.
between 12 noon on Sunday, the 5th of October 1975 and 06:45 a.m. on Wednesday, the 8th of October 1975. Do you understand the caution?
Yes, I understand the caution.
Your arrest is necessary for the prompt and effective investigation of the offence.
It's ridiculous.
Castree was arrested on the 5th of November 2006 and charged with Lesley's murder. He denied everything.
Did you kill Lesley Susan Molseed?
I did not.
Do you know anything about the murder?
No. I have no knowledge. I've certainly never met this dead girl or any member of her family. I have no knowledge as to how you come to say a sample of my DNA is found at that place, especially after 30 years.
Whatever. The DNA evidence was the final, irrefutable link. The next day, he was formally charged. At his plea hearing, he pleaded not guilty. Of course he did. The trial began on the 23rd of October 2007 at Bradford Crown Court. Now, this trial is a lot easier to wrap up. The defence had little to work with. Their strategy centred on attacking the DNA evidence, suggesting that the age of the samples made them unreliable. They attempted to portray Castree as a man with a troubled past, but that didn't make him a murderer. In this case, it did. Basically, their arguments were thin. The prosecution's case was detailed and compelling. They laid out Castree's history of sexual offences, his presence in the area at the time of the murder, and the forensic evidence that linked him directly to Lesley's killing. Dr. Gemma Escott told the jury the chances of the semen coming from anyone other than Ronald Castree were more than 1 in a billion. Throughout the trial, Castree remained calm and emotionless. They always do, don't they? He showed no remorse, no empathy, no reaction to the suffering of Lesley's family. After hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated for just under 12 hours. On the 12th of November 2007, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. Castree was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years. Now look, I know he's probably going to die in prison. But a minimum term of 30 years, really? That should have just been for what he did to Lesley. What about paying the price for Stefan? What about the children he abused? He should get life with no minimum terms. The judge described the murder as a wicked and terrible crime and condemned Castree for allowing an innocent man to suffer in his place. The courtroom erupted with emotion. The Molseed family wept with relief. Members of the Kiszko family felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Justice had finally been served, but far too late for Stefan and his mother Charlotte, who had both died before seeing the real killer brought to justice. But at least now, the truth about Lesley Molseed's murder could finally be known.
I feel angry towards the police, the way they handled all of this.
Why?
Because they should never have arrested me. They should have arrested the right person.
So that was the tragic case of Lesley Molseed and Stefan Kiszko. Tragically, April, Lesley's mother, passed away in 2014. Thank God she got to see justice for her daughter. Fred Molseed, Lesley's older brother. Now, I mentioned him at the start of the case because I believe he was on the rota to go to the shop that day instead of Lesley. Tragically, in 2005, Fred took his own life. He had a wife and 3 children. The inquest said his complex family history and Lesley's murder may have been a factor in his death. I've said before, haven't I, so many times about the ripple effects that crimes aren't contained to just the immediate victims, but the families and the people affected by them. It's so horrendously tragic. I was so gutted when I read that because it's just to feel, I don't know whether he felt guilt or what, but whatever he felt, for him to do that to himself and to leave a family behind, it's just awful. This was a case that shows how much damage a single wrong assumption can cause. Stefan's only crime was being different. And so many lives were destroyed because of assumptions made about a man who didn't fit the mould. What remains now is the hope that their stories continue to remind us why getting it right the first time matters. You be kind, and hopefully see you back here again at my true criminal abode. Bye.